There is a profession in Egypt that watched empires rise and fall. It was there when the pyramids of Giza were still new, covered in gleaming white stone under the sun. It was there when Ramesses II ruled as a living god. It was there when the Romans arrived, when the Arabs arrived, when the Ottomans arrived, when the British arrived. Kings fell. Entire religions vanished. Hieroglyphic writing was forgotten for more than 1,000 years, and no one on earth could read what the ancient Egyptians had written on their temple walls. And yet, this profession never stopped. It crossed more than 4,000 years without interruption, and today, if you travel to certain villages along the Nile River, you will still find men doing exactly what their ancestors did in the time of the pharaohs. This is the story of the Egyptian farmer, the fellah, and of the tool that carried Egypt on its back for millennia, the shaduf. To understand why this profession survived when almost everything around it crumbled, you need to understand one simple thing. Ancient Egypt was not made of stone. It was made of water. The entire civilization, the temples, the armies, the pharaohs, the scribes, all of it existed only because once a year, the Nile River overflowed and covered the land with a rich, black, fertile silt. The Egyptians called this silt Kemet, the Black Land, and that is where the ancient name for Egypt itself comes from. Without that flood, there was no harvest. Without a harvest, there were no taxes. Without taxes, there was no army, no temples, no pharaoh. The whole civilization depended on one single thing: someone putting that water exactly where it needed to be, at the right time, in the right amount. And that person was the fellah, the farmer. The problem was that the Nile's flood was generous for only a few weeks. After that, the water dropped, and the higher fields dried out again. That is when the Egyptians created one of the most ingenious, and at the same time, one of the simplest inventions in human history, the shaduf. A wooden post planted in the ground, with a horizontal beam swinging like a seesaw. On one end, a bucket. On the other, a counterweight of clay or stone. The farmer pushed the bucket into the river, filled it with water, and the counterweight on the other side did almost all the work of lifting that weight back up. One man alone, with this mechanism, could irrigate land that lay beyond the natural reach of the flood. It sounds like a small thing, seen from today, but it multiplied the amount of farmable land in Egypt. It fed the armies that built an empire. It paid for the stone blocks of Giza, the statues of Abu Simbel, the temples of Karnak. And the most striking part, the design of this device, created around 1500 BC, has barely changed since. Think about that for a moment. 4,000 years separate us from whoever invented the shaduf. In that time, the world invented the iron wheel, gunpowder, the steam engine, electricity, the airplane, the computer, artificial intelligence. And yet, in several villages in Egypt, along the Nile Valley, there are still men using that exact same mechanism, in the exact same way, for the exact same purpose. This is not nostalgia. It is not a show put on for tourists. It is simply because it works. It is cheap, it needs no fuel, it needs no imported parts, it rarely breaks, and any farmer can repair it alone with wood and rope. While great empires spent fortunes on armies and monuments that later turned to ruin, this humble technology kept doing its job, quietly, generation after generation. Now imagine the life of that man in ancient Egypt. He woke up before sunrise. The fellah's life was organized around 3 seasons, defined entirely by the river's behavior. Ake, the flood season, when the fields lay submerged and planting was impossible. Parait, when the waters receded and the black, fertile land appeared, ready to receive the seeds. And Shimu, the harvest season, when the heat returned in full force and entire families worked from dawn until dusk, cutting wheat and barley with flint sickles. During Ake, when there was no way to plant, many of these same farmers were called up to work on the state's great building projects. This is where one of the biggest myths about ancient Egypt comes from: the idea that the pyramids were built by whipped slaves. Modern archaeology shows a different reality. They were, in large part, the fellahin themselves, working during the flood season as a kind of mandatory service to the state, receiving food, beer, and shelter in return. The very same man who lifted water from the Nile with the shaduf also helped raise the stone blocks that still stand today, thousands of years later. And there was an almost absurdly rigorous system of control surrounding all of this. Along the Nile, the Egyptians built what are known as nilometers, stone markers carved directly into the river, with notches that measured the exact height of the flood every year. This was not scientific curiosity. This was one of the oldest documented tax collection systems in history. If the Nilometer recorded a high flood, the Pharaoh's scribes already knew. The harvest will be good, taxes go up. If the flood was low, it signaled famine ahead, and taxes had to be adjusted so as not to destroy farming families. Government scribes walked the fields after the harvest, measured the amount of grain produced, calculated roughly 20% as tribute, and no excuse was accepted. Failing to pay meant punishment, debt, sometimes forced labor. And the worst possible scenario for a fellow was not a weak flood. It was a catastrophically high one, capable of breaking through the earthen dikes he himself had built with his own hands, destroying homes, drowning livestock, and ruining stored grain. In other words, the Egyptian farmer lived entirely at the mercy of nature, but he had developed such precise knowledge of the Nile's behavior that he could predict, weeks in advance, what was coming, just by watching the water rise, inch by inch, at the nearest Nilometer. This knowledge was not written down on any papyrus preserved for posterity. It lived in practical memory, passed from father to son, generation after generation, across more than 30 dynasties. And it is exactly this transmission, from father to son, that explains why this profession never disappeared. Unlike the scribes, whose writing was lost for centuries. Unlike the priests, whose temples were closed and whose gods were abandoned. Unlike the armies, which dissolved along with the pharaoh's power. The fellah's knowledge never depended on a government, a religion, or a political system to survive. It depended on only one thing: the need to eat. As long as people live along the banks of the Nile, someone will need to pull water from the river and put it on the crops. Pharaohs fell. Foreign empires came and went. But hunger never stopped existing, and that is why the farmer's work never stopped being necessary. Today, of course, most of Egypt uses motor-powered pumps to irrigate its fields. But in more remote regions, in small villages of Upper Egypt, you can still find the shaduf in use, swinging slowly along the riverbank, exactly as it appears in paintings found inside tombs more than 3,000 years old. If you compare a tomb painting made for the New Kingdom, showing a man operating this device, with a photograph taken just a few years ago in a village by the Nile, the scene is nearly identical. The posture of the body is the same. The angle of the arm is the same. The stance of someone pushing the bucket into the water and waiting for the counterweight to do the work is the same. It is like looking straight through a hole in time, directly into the past. There is another layer to this story that few people stop to think about. The image most people have of ancient Egypt comes from the pharaohs, the mummies, the golden temples, the treasures of Tutankhamun. But that was the life of a tiny fraction of the population. The vast majority of Egyptians who lived across 3,000 years of history never saw the inside of a palace, never touched gold, never had their name carved in stone. They were farmers. They were ordinary people, growing wheat, barley, flax, tending oxen, lifting water with the shaduf under the relentless sun of the Nile Valley. This entire civilization, with all its splendor and grandeur that still fills museums around the world today, was built on the backs of these anonymous people. And it is precisely this anonymous profession, without glory, without statues, without a single temple dedicated to it, that remains alive today, while the golden splendor of the pharaohs turned to stone and dust behind museum glass. There is something deeply ironic in that. The pharaohs built gigantic monuments precisely so they would be remembered forever. They wanted eternity. They spent fortunes, mobilized armies of workers, dedicated decades of their lives to this single goal, never being forgotten. And in a way, they succeeded. Their names are still studied in schools, their faces still appear on magazine covers, their tombs still draw millions of tourists every year. But the profession that truly crossed time without interruption, without needing stone, without needing gold, without needing any temple at all, was that of the ordinary man who never sought eternity in the first place. All he wanted was water for his crops and food on his family's table. And it is precisely because he never sought glory that he achieved something no pharaoh ever truly did. He kept on existing, in practice, every single day, right up to now. Perhaps that is the quietest lesson ancient Egypt can teach us. Greatness and power crumble. Empires fall. Gods are forgotten. But essential work, the kind that keeps people alive, fed, surviving, that work never loses its value, even when no one writes poems about it, even when no statue is ever raised in its honor. As you read these words right now, it is quite likely that in some small village along the banks of the Nile, a man is repeating, with his body in his hands, the exact same movement another man made 4,000 years ago, under the same sun, on the same bank of the same river. Pharaohs came and went. The Egypt of the gods turned into tourist ruins. But the shadow keeps swinging slowly, stubbornly, moving through time as if, for it, time simply does not exist.